Picture a city of nearly 2 million people sinking into darkness, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. The clock reads 11 at night, and Havana is blacked out. Not from a storm, not from an earthquake, by the decision of one man sitting 2,000 miles away. Now picture that man never deployed a single soldier. He never dropped a single bomb. He simply signed a piece of paper. And with that paper, he cut off the oxygen supply of an entire nation. This is not science fiction. This is not a futuristic war scenario. This is happening right now. In February of 2026, Cuba fell into the deepest crisis in its history since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the question nobody can answer is, how much longer can the regime hold on?
Compatriotas, en este momento crucial recordemos sacrificios de nuestras Abiguer atosaron, huyendo por desafíos y forjaremos un futuro próspero.
To understand what is going on, we have to go back to January 29th of 2026. That day, Donald Trump signed an executive order. Short, blunt, devastating. In just a few lines, the American president declared that any country selling oil to Cuba would be hit with tariffs. Not only Cuba would be targeted, any nation that tried to help it would face consequences as well. The impact was immediate. Mexico, which had been shipping as many as 12,000 barrels a day to the island, suspended deliveries that very same week. Russia, a longtime ally of the regime, began pulling out its tourists stranded in Havana and signaled that it would pause its flights. Venezuela, which had supplied Cuba with oil for years in exchange for doctors, had lost its leader. Nicolas Maduro was detained by American forces in January and taken to New York. With him gone, Cuba's last major fuel lifeline vanished. The siege was locked in. Cuba at that point depended on oil to generate 80% of its electricity. No fuel meant no power. No power meant hospitals could not function. Without functioning hospitals, there was no way to keep alive an island that had depended on the state to breathe for decades. On the streets of Havana, the smell of piled-up garbage took over entire neighborhoods. Garbage trucks stopped running for lack of diesel. Stacks of black plastic bags spread across sidewalks. Children who would normally arrive at school by 7 in the morning stayed home. Classes were suspended across much of the country to cut down on energy use. At night, something extraordinary happened again. The stars. Right in the heart of the Cuban capital, with most of the city buried in darkness, the night sky appeared clean and packed with stars that entire generations had never seen over Havana. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. The kind of beauty that is born from collapse. Cities in the interior sank even deeper. Santiago de Cuba, the country's second largest city, recorded a 50% drop in street lighting compared to its historical average. Holguin, the gateway to the resort towns along the northern coast, watched its streetlights go out one by one. And while the world looked on from a distance, the Cuban people went to sleep in the dark, woke up in the dark, and tried to survive in the dark. Chapter 2. The Chain Reaction. On February 8th of 2026, Cuba made an announcement that stopped the travel industry cold. Cuba's Civil Aviation Authority notified all airlines. Starting February 10th at midnight, there would be no more jet fuel available. Not a single drop of jet fuel to refuel any aircraft in the country. The news hit tourism like a hammer. Air Canada, WestJet, and Transat, the three largest Canadian operators flying to Cuba, suspended all flights. According to analysis by aviation firm Cirium, a total of 1,709 flights would be canceled through April. Russia, Cuba's third largest source of tourists, began evacuating its citizens stranded in hotels and announced a full suspension of routes. The Spanish hotel chain Meliá, the island's largest operator with 30 properties, immediately shut down 3 of them and consolidated guests into its higher capacity locations. NH Hotels shut down every one of its hotels in Cuba the same day. The beaches of Varadero, which had once buzzed with Canadian and European tourists escaping the winter cold, emptied out within days. White sands, turquoise water, folded up umbrellas, not a single beach chair in use. No distant laughter, just the wind blowing past empty lounge chairs in a paradise that was being erased in real time. The collapse of tourism was not merely symbolic. It was the final artery being cut. Because Cuba does not produce oil, The country imports virtually everything it uses, and the dollars that paid for those imports came in large part from tourists spending money at hotels, hiring guides, and renting cars. In 2025, only 1.8 million visitors landed on the island, the lowest number in more than 2 decades. With the jet fuel ban in place, that figure was heading toward zero in 2026. No tourists meant no dollars. No dollars meant no imports. No imports meant no food. And Cuba was importing the vast majority of its food after decades of agricultural policies that had gutted the Cuban countryside. In the markets of Havana, vendors reported growing difficulty getting fruits and vegetables from rural areas into the capital. Transportation had stopped. Prices had tripled. A vendor named Anayasi, who chose not to give her last name for speaking critically about the situation, said she was paying 2 or 3 times more just to restock her stall. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel appeared on television. Sunken eyes, a measured voice. He asked the population to resist creatively. He called for a wartime mindset. He said the country would eat whatever it could grow locally. That if fuel continued to run out, food would not be able to move from some municipalities to others. He was saying in carefully chosen words that parts of Cuba might begin to go hungry. In recent weeks, the United Nations issued a formal alert about the risk of a humanitarian collapse in Cuba. Secretary General Antonio Guterres voiced public concern. China, a quiet ally of the regime, announced it would ship 90,000 metric tons of rice and extend an $80 million financial assistance line. Russia signaled it would send humanitarian aid, including petroleum supplies, which generated new friction with Washington. But while allies were sending scraps, American pressure kept climbing. Trump stated in an interview, "No oil, no money, no nothing." Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban exiles, publicly declared that the only thing he planned to discuss with the island's communist leadership was when they would hand over power. No negotiation, no soft landing, surrender or collapse. Díaz-Canel responded with a line that echoed through the walls of a country without electricity. Surrender was not an option, but the regime he led had declared a state of war. It had adopted the concept of war of the entire people, a strategy created by Fidel Castro in the 1980s to mobilize the entire population in the event of an outside attack. The problem was that this wartime rhetoric barely found any traction on the streets. People were too worn out to fight. They were just trying to stay alive. Chapter 3. Lula in a Trap. 6,000 miles from Havana, in Brasilia, the phone of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva would not stop ringing. His party, the PT, had formally declared that the United States was carrying out a criminal assault against Cuba. His government had received an official distress call from the island. Groups of Brazilian oil workers were pushing a campaign called Oil for Cuba, pressuring Petrobras to send fuel on an emergency basis. Lula was caught in a two-sided trap. On one side, Cuba, a historic ally of the PT, a symbol of the Latin American left, a country that had trained doctors and engineers for Brazil for decades. On the other side, Trump, the same man who had slapped 50% tariffs on Brazilian exports, who had threatened sanctions against any country that dared to supply the island. If Lula sent oil, he risked a full-blown trade war with the world's largest economy. If he did not send it, he was abandoning an ally on the edge of collapse. On February 7th of 2026, during the PT's 46th anniversary event in Salvador, Lula took the stage. The crowd was expecting a bold statement, a clear position. The president said, "Our country stands in solidarity with the Cuban people who are victims of a massacre of American speculation. We have to find, as a party, a way to help." He did not say how. He did not say when. He did not say what. In the days that followed, the Brazilian government held internal meetings involving the Brazilian Cooperation Agency, which falls under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They were exploring the possibility of sending food and medicine, not oil. The distinction was strategic. Food and medicine counted as humanitarian aid. Oil would be a direct challenge to Trump's executive order. Lula's team knew the president was planning to visit Trump in Washington in March. The Cuba question would end up on the table, But how do you negotiate that with a man who had publicly declared that the Cuban regime should not survive to see the end of 2026? How do you ask for a softening of sanctions from the very person who had built this stranglehold specifically to force a collapse? Behind all the solidarity rhetoric, there was a hard reality the PT preferred not to say out loud. Brazil needed a working relationship with the United States. The agribusiness sector, the backbone of the Brazilian economy, depended on international markets where Washington carried decisive weight. American tariffs were already bleeding Brazilian exporters dry. An open confrontation over Cuba could make all of that even worse, and here lies the contradiction that nobody is telling us about this crisis. For 65 years, the embargo existed. For 65 years, Cuba held on. Every time Washington tightened the screws, the regime survived. Because there was always a pressure valve, first the Soviet Union, then Chavista Venezuela, then Mexico, then China. There was always someone willing to supply the fuel that the regime needed to keep standing. In 2026, for the first time in all of that history, that valve was gone. Trump did not just blockade Cuba, he blockaded every country that tried to help it. Venezuela was crippled with Maduro's detention. Mexico pulled back out of fear of tariffs. Russia was bogged down in Ukraine. China was sending rice but not nearly enough oil. And Brazil, under Lula, was frozen between solidarity and economic survival. The Cuban people, who never had a voice in choosing their leaders, were paying the price for decades of decisions that were never theirs to make. The stars shining over a darkened Havana were the cruelest symbol of this story. The darker the island grew, the clearer it became that the regime had built a prison with no emergency exit. And when the siege finally closed in, the ones locked inside were not the government. It was the people. If you made it this far, you already know more about this crisis than 90% of people out there. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is happening in Cuba before it is too late for any response.